Hello, I'm Natalie Zett, and welcome to Flower in the River. This podcast, inspired by my book of the same name, explores the 1915 Eastland disaster in Chicago and its enduring impact, particularly on my family's history. We'll explore the intertwining narratives of others impacted by this tragedy as well, and we'll dive into writing and genealogy and uncover the surprising supernatural elements that surface in family history research. Come along with me on this journey of discovery. Hey, this is Natalie, and welcome to episode 99 of Flower in the River podcast. One of the most fascinating aspects of my research into the Eastland disaster, well, I should say more specifically the people affected by it, has been examining how the newspapers of the time reported on what happened. And what I love about these newspapers is that they often include firsthand accounts. And if you've been listening to this podcast over the past year and a half, you've probably noticed something interesting. While many of these first-person accounts are similar, none of them are exactly the same. And in a sense, why would they be? Each person sees an event through their own lens, shaped by their experiences and perspective. That's why multiple reports of the same tragedy can differ, not necessarily in the major facts, but in the details and emotions captured. According to the genealogical proof standard, conducting reasonably exhaustive research is essential, gathering as much information from as many sources as possible to build a strong case. But even with that approach, a completely accurate picture of what happened is pretty challenging. No one alive today witnessed the disaster firsthand, and as we know, human memory itself is fallible. Two people can see the same event and recall it in entirely different ways. And that brings me to another aspect of this research: how the media of the time shaped public perception of the Eastland disaster. As a journalist myself, I closely examine how newspapers covered this tragedy, questioning whether reports were entirely accurate, especially given the challenges of real-time reporting in 1915. And I'm not trying to be critical, but I have come across errors, misspellings, misquotes, and discrepancies in names. And I'll always say this: they did the best they could considering what was going on, and considering the fact that they didn't have an internet to help them move information along. And some reports to this day remain unverifiable, though not necessarily because they were false, but because they were lacking supporting documentation. Still, I'll share all these accounts with you. However, this is raw research as I find it, and the best I can do is report what I find and also tell you where I got the information. Just this week, I was going back and forth with another writer and saying the biggest problems that I have seen actually don't lie in 1915. They lie in current time when certain organizations or websites don't report where they got their information from. 1915 was one thing. 2025, that's a little bit different. So I would always say, and I will always say each week actually, please cite your sources. Where did you get this information from? I know you weren't there, so please tell us where it comes from. But my hope is always, as more records become available, that future researchers can dig deeper, sorting fact from fiction with greater clarity. And as usual, there's a lot to unpack today, so let's jump in. So, several months ago, I began reading different articles from a publication called The Scoop. And let me give you a little history about that because it has been a while. So, let's talk about the Chicago Press Club. This organization was formed, or founded, I should say, in 1880 as a social organization for journalists in Chicago, and it quickly became one of the largest and most prominent press clubs in the United States during the peak years from about 1900 to 1930. And one of the things that they did was they created a weekly publication called The Scoop. And The Scoop provided some really interesting, detailed information about how different newspapers covered the Eastland disaster of 1915. And I've been working my way very slowly through the coverage, through each chapter, where they summarized how different newspapers covered the story. And I want to talk about how a couple of New York publications covered the story of the Eastland disaster. And you might be thinking, what? What does that have to do with Chicago? Hang in there with that, okay? So we will be reading from The Scoop, July 31st, 1915. And so far, we've worked our way through various Chicago papers, such as the Chicago Post, the Chicago Daily News, the Chicago Tribune, where The Scoop summarized how they covered the Eastland disaster. And now we're moving on to New York. The New York Times. The Western Union tally sheets show that H. Percy Miller sent to the Times at New York on Saturday evening between 6:40 and 11:30 o'clock, 15,331 words straight narrative. This is a record day's work and will, as such, stand to his credit. He kept 3 keys pounding without cessation and kept copy ahead of the call throughout those 5 hours. His report, supplemented by the Associated Press lists, occupied 21 columns of the New York Sunday Times. In the same issue, pictures of the Eastland and of the river and docks between Clark and Wells Street bridges. He had directed the Home Office to a pictorial news service in New York where the photographs were stored. Sunday, Mr. Miller sent 7,323 words with a sheaf of the best pictures that had been taken there. This also was first-hand narrative, not pickup. The Times ran it flat, ahead of statistical matter in the AP report. Through his effort, the Times made a most complete showing. The Times and the World are the only New York papers maintaining special representatives in Chicago. I want to pause just for a moment before reading the second part of this article in The Scoop. Before me, I do have an open copy of the July 25th, 1915 issue of the New York Times, and here are some of the headlines. Over to the right, you have a gigantic heading that says, 1,800 drown as excursion steamer capsizes, loaded to capacity in the Chicago River. Top heavy, she was started while moored. That's the big headline about the Eastland disaster. And then we have these subheadings. Sinks in barely 6 minutes. That's pretty much accurate, by the way. Great majority of victims, women and children bound for picnic, also seems to be accurate. Hundreds trapped below. Throngs dumped from upper decks into the river to struggle and die. Chicago puts on mourning. Rows of bodies awaiting identification fill armory. Heroes not lacking. All those little headlines summarize pretty much what we've learned so far about the Eastland disaster and seem to be accurate. They also have a listing of previous ship disasters that show, quote unquote, no such record of lives lost. They're saying this is really extreme here. Here's some other headings from the front page. Scenes drive diver mad. Unable to withstand the shocking experiences in hold among dead. Stories of the rescued. Deckhand pictures victims dropping by hundreds into the river. Boats' stairways jammed. Panic's growth as vessels list increased, swimmers dragged under. Then there's another heading that says Eastland's death list 1,810. Latest official records show, of course, that's not quite accurate. We actually don't know the number of people who died on the Eastland. The other set of headlines, 30 put under arrest. City, state, and federal authorities begin investigations. Vessel always unstable. Overloading and unseaworthiness alleged as causes of the disaster. Calls federal grand jury. Contradictory stories told of tug's part in dragging the Eastland over. So, just by looking at those headings, you get a good sense of what has happened here and now the action steps that are being taken. On the next page, there are 8 columns totally devoted to the Eastland disaster. In other words, the entire page, the entire second page, has all Eastland disaster news. I will read some of that for you, not all of it, because we'd be here for a while. But it's worth exploring. And again, the entire third page is filled with Eastland disaster-related information. So from the sounds of it, H. Percy Miller was indeed the person doing the writing, the inputting, and the transmitting of this information from his Chicago office to the New York Times. Bylines weren't always common, so had we not read the scoop, we wouldn't know who the writer was of all this information, but it looks like, according to the scoop, that it was H. Percy Miller. Okay, so now we're going to go to a discussion about another publication that no longer exists, but it was called The New York World. And here is the article. John Fay lives at the Alexandria on the north side. He came down early Saturday morning on a personal errand. Crossing Rush Street Bridge a little after 8 o'clock, he noticed a commotion 2 bridges away and went through River and Water Streets. He is a hardened veteran with a full endowment of that impersonality which newspapermen must have if they are to deal with events that would unman the ordinary. He has seen death in many forms, single and in masses, in many parts of the earth, during the 26 years of his engagement with the New York World. This was the first such sight that touched his emotions in their depths, not by its magnitude, but by its pathos. These victims were not like others, such as they that perished with the Titanic and with the Lusitania. They were poor people, most of them young, poor people, props of families, as John puts it, quote, the ones that bring home the honey. The thing that ground him most was the sight of so many bodies of lightly clad young girls, from which the clothing had been ripped away, being carried almost naked in the arms or over the shoulders of big men and bound together in bunches of 3 to 5, like cordwood, to be loaded into trucks and carried off to morgue. He made his own investigation and got back to his desk at the Tribune office, whence he sent a story of 8,500 words, which led the New York World Sunday morning ahead of the lists and other data sent by the Associated Press. Further, he advised New York where to find pictures of the ship and several scenes in the neighborhood of Clark Street Bridge. His second and third day stories were gravely written and impressive, and he sent full sets of pictures to accompany them. Unfortunately, that's the end of this piece, and to date, I've been unable to locate those articles that John Fay wrote. But I know you've all heard of the New York Times, but most people, myself included, had not heard of the New York World. And this is what I found out about them, and this is from the Encyclopedia Britannica online. The World was established in 1860 as a penny paper with a basically religious orientation. It supported President Abraham Lincoln's prosecution of the American Civil War and his other policies, but it lost money and was sold to a consortium of New York City Democrats and abruptly turned on Lincoln after the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863. The paper was shut down by federal authorities for 2 days in 1864 for publishing a fabricated report indicating that the North would draft 400,000 more men for the Union armies. In 1868, the paper published a statistical and historical annual, the World Almanac. Its publication continues to this day. The World is most closely associated with publisher Joseph Pulitzer, who purchased the newspaper in 1883. Its coverage became increasingly flamboyant, particularly its Sunday edition under the editorship of Arthur Brisbane. When William Randolph Hearst bought the competing New York Journal in 1895, he lured Pulitzer's celebrated Sunday newspaper staff to the Journal with the promise of raises. All but one secretary accepted Hearst's offer. Pulitzer lured them back to the World with raises of his own, but then Hearst made a counteroffer, causing many to return to the Journal. It was said that the sidewalk between the two newspapers was growing thin. Rivalry between the two newspapers, especially when both published cartoons based on the Yellow Kid character in Richard Felton Outcault's comics, gave rise to the term yellow journalism. It was an era marked by publicity stunts, screaming headlines, and sensationalism as the newspapers competed for readers, staff, advertisers, and public attention. The World played a major role in whipping up the jingoistic spirit that led the United States into the Spanish-American War. The World was known for its numerous outstanding reporters, columnists, editors, and cartoonists. By 1930, the paper's circulation had declined after a price increase, and heavy losses induced Pulitzer's son, Joseph Pulitzer II, to sell the paper to the Scripps Howard chain. In 1931, the World was combined with the New York Evening Telegram, founded in 1867, to become the New York World Telegram. The latter lasted until 1966. Another merger creation, the New York World Journal-Tribune, lasted less than a year, closing in 1967. Well, New York World, rest in peace, but what a history that is. Now, if you're new to this podcast and you're hearing this information for the first time, you might be thinking, so, does this mean the reporting on the Eastland disaster was ginned up or exaggerated or sensationalized? I would have to say, largely, no, it was not. Only because through the course of my own research and reporting here on this podcast, I have so many eyewitness accounts, firsthand accounts, and things like that. And they're from so many different people, men, women, even children. Some of the people were on the boat, some were witnesses, some people were just walking by and they just happened to see this thing. So there are different accounts, but they all have a lot of similarities, even though obviously the people themselves had different perspectives. So in the case of something authentically tragic like the Eastland disaster, people really didn't need to sensationalize much. Not to say they didn't, but they really didn't need to do that. The only thing I would say is that in the ensuing years, different organizations that have the Eastland as their primary or secondary focus even have had some interesting ways of approaching it. I'm not sure what the motivations always are, but oftentimes they'll put forth certain stories and they'll neglect the rest of the stories. And as I've often said, there are over 800 people who lost their lives on this thing, and there should be at least that many stories, and there just aren't, which is the gap I've been trying to fill during this time. And it's not that difficult. The way I've been dealing with it each week is taking community by community or person by person, and right now, I'd say I've got over 200 stories that have never been shared in their entirety, until now. So that's pretty good. And there's a lot more that I need to do, but it really is not that difficult. It just takes time and the will to research these people, but it's actually really interesting. But do I think, based on my research, that these stories about the Eastland disaster were sensationalized? No, I don't think it was overly sensationalized. I know there were some errors, but that's different because consider how quickly they had to get this information out. And I'm still always impressed with the work that the journalists did at that point in history. So here's another interesting thing that I have found. So the New York Times articles, and I'm going to read a few of those to you so you can hear their perspective in the accounts that they were able to capture. They mirror exactly, in some cases, what was reported in the Chicago Tribune. So, did the writers for the New York Times do it first, and then the Chicago Tribune followed behind and copied that information? In other words, who got it into the wire first? Well, each paper would like to tell you that they did it first, but in fact, I'm not sure we can ever figure that out. But I know that everybody contributed to it in one form or the other, but it is just one of those things that's a bit of a head scratcher. When I was trying to do some source citing for the various stories that I'll share with you, in this case, there was a conflict in where did these stories come from? Some said Chicago Tribune, others New York Times. The New York Times mirrored what was in the Chicago Tribune, or the Chicago Tribune mirrored what was in the New York Times. So what in the heck was going on? I don't know yet, but it's just something to keep in mind as we explore the New York newspaper's coverage of the Eastland disaster. Now, let's bring it back home. So what you just heard were a couple of articles about the New York paper's coverage of the Eastland disaster, and that appeared in the July 30th, 1915 issue of The Scoop, which again was a trade journal for journalists, and it was published by the Chicago Press Club. And now what we're going to do is go into the New York Times and take a look at some of those articles that most likely were written by H. Percy Miller, who was the Chicago correspondent for the New York Times. Who was H. Percy Miller in the first place? Well, surprisingly, there's not a ton of information about him online, but he was born in London, England. He married another woman from England, and they immigrated to the United States with their two sons. By 1891, he became a naturalized citizen. By 1900, he was living in Brooklyn with his wife and sons, and he was working as a journalist. And at some point, he came to Chicago, and he passed away on November 24th, 1949, at the age of 85 in Elgin, Illinois. And here is Percy Miller's obituary. H. Percy Miller, retired Chicago correspondent and former foreign correspondent for the New York Times, died yesterday in St. Joseph's Hospital, Elgin, Illinois. He was 85 years old. Mr. Miller, whose home was in Carpentersville, Illinois, retired early in 1928 after 15 years as Chicago correspondent for the Times. Early in his career, he had made several trips around the world for the paper as a correspondent. He was born in England on April 2nd, 1864. Among Mr. Miller's prized possessions were personal letters from former presidents Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, and many other prominent Americans whom he knew personally. He served for several years as the president of the old Chicago Press Club after his election in 1915. Again, that's the year of the Eastland disaster. Surviving are a son, Herbert P., of New Dorp, Staten Island, New York, 2 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren. And as for John Fay, I don't have nearly as much about him, but I'm still researching him. So let's go on and listen to the articles that most likely Percy Miller authored in the New York Times. So this first story appeared in the July 25th, 1915 issue of the New York Times, and that would be one day after the Eastland disaster to keep it in perspective. Headline: Took alarm too late, declare the survivors. Experiences of the rescued. Mother had to let daughter drown. Special to the New York Times. Chicago, July 24th. One of the thrilling stories of the Eastland disaster is told by E. W. Sladkey, head of the Western Electric Company's printing department. Mr. Sladkey, the last to board the Eastland and the first to escape, walked over the upper side of the vessel and jumped to the deck of the tug Kenosha without so much as wetting his feet. Mr. Sladkey said that the excursion boat's officers and crew gave no warning of the impending disaster until the vessel had heeled beyond an angle of 45 degrees. He agreed with other survivors that the excursionists took alarm too late. Quote, "It was about 7:30 o'clock when I ran along the pier to get aboard the Eastland," said Mr. Sladkey. "They had just hauled in the gangway and were casting off the stern line. I noticed that the boat was listing to port, and the thought flashed into my mind that there might be trouble before we got far." A crowd of about 30 of the boys and girls employed in my department were waving their hands to me and calling to me from the upper deck, and I jumped aboard. As I made my way to the upper deck, the list was even more perceptible. My people were up in the bow, and I went to them, keeping on the starboard side, which was uppermost and closest to the pier. I know a little about boats, and I wondered the Eastland's officers were not taking some steps to right the boat, which kept heeling further and further, very slowly. From what I could see, it did not appear that a great majority of the crowd was on the lowering port side, and I could not account for the list. Slow to take fright. The Eastland was leaning over at an angle of about 45 degrees when the crew and passengers became alarmed. After that, it went over quickly, and the shout of warning from the sailors and officers came too late. In an instant, passengers who were not like myself, gripping the starboard rail or leaning against the starboard side of the deck houses, were slipping down the deck. In another instant, it was all over with the Eastland. I waited until the port rail was in the water and then climbed out on the upturned starboard side, calling to others to follow me. A few did, I noticed, but my cry was drowned in the chorus of screams that went up as the Eastland flopped over. Apparently realizing what was coming, the captain of the Kenosha had backed up until the stern of his vessel was close to the Eastland's bow. The tug was still a few feet away when I jumped, but I made its deck, and a number of others came after me. Of the whole party from my department, I saw only one alive afterward, and that was one of the boys who had followed me." End quote. Headline: Mother saves her son. Mrs. A. Fitzgerald, another survivor, told of saving herself and her son Edward, 5 years old. Her husband, William Fitzgerald, was drowned. Quote, "The three of us were on the deck, and we were thrown into the water," Mrs. Fitzgerald said. "I seized my son, Edward, while the boat was tipping, and after we struck the water, I clung to him around the neck. We drifted in toward the wharf, and I caught hold of some piling and clung to it until we were rescued. John Morey, a Western Electric Company employee, another of the rescued, in describing his experience said, quote, "I was on the upper deck when the boat began to list. I caught hold of the rail and held on as the boat went over on its side. A loose chair swung around and struck me on the forehead, but I managed to keep my hold on the rail until I was helped to land. There were more than 500 on my side of the boat at the time, and many of them must have drowned." George Mihaliuk was thrown into the river and grasped the hair of a boy and swam to the pier with him. "I was standing at the rail," he said, "when the boat began to tip and caught hold of Frank Cerny, my companion. We went under twice, and when I came up the second time, there was a boy at my side. I thought it was Frank. I grabbed him and swam ashore, but it was a strange boy." "9 girls and I were in a stateroom having a little party of our own, and all of a sudden we felt the boat going over," said Miss Lottie Anderson, another survivor. "We all fell in a heap. The shrieks of the women in the other staterooms were frightful. I fell into the water and did not see my sister or any one of the 8 others after that." End quote. Headline: Saved by a Nail. Joe Brozak was saved because his coat caught on a nail. Quote, "I was with a party of 4, and they were all drowned," said Brozak. "My coat caught on a nail when the boat went over, and I was held above the water. If it had not been for the nail, I would now be at the bottom of the river, I suppose, with the others of my party." Frank Vantek, who was among the saved, lost his wife and 3 children. Vantek was pulled out of the water. "I could not believe the boat was turning over," Vantek said. "About a dozen of the 150 persons on the upper deck jumped, and the rest were thrown into the river. I did not see my wife or children after the boat turned. They were carried into the river with the crowd. Someone grabbed me around the neck and kept dragging at me. It was a woman, but I could not save her." Had to let daughter sink. Mrs. H.A. Thayer, 32 years old, another of the rescued, told of clinging to her 2 children, Harry, 7 years old, and Helen, 8 years old, after they and her husband, William Thayer, had been pitched into the river. Mrs. Thayer and Harry were rescued. She lost her hold on Helen, and the daughter and Mr. Thayer, it is believed, were drowned. "My husband and I and the children were standing together on the deck and fell into the water in a heap," she said. "I am a good swimmer. I caught hold of my son Harry and my little girl Helen and clung to them and kept myself up in some way. I don't know how. I saw men and women tumbling into the water around me. My husband disappeared among them. I held Harry with my right arm and Helen with my left. I seemed to lose all strength in my left arm, and I had to let go of Helen. She went down in the struggling mass. Then someone, a man with a uniform on, grabbed me and began swimming with me. I clung to my son, and when swept near the riverbank, some men pulled us up. Helen and her father must have gone down." L.D. Gattery employed as a candy seller on the Eastland, in describing his experience, said, "It was about 7:40 o'clock this morning, and the boat was lying at the pier near the Clark Street Bridge, loading with passengers. We were to leave in 20 minutes, and the upper deck and the cabins were crowded with passengers. There were hundreds of women and children. I estimate that there were between 2,000 and 3,000 on the boat at the time of the accident. I was standing on the lower deck near the gangplank watching the people come aboard. Suddenly, I noticed the boat list toward the center of the river. It rolled slightly at first and then seemed to stop. Then it started to roll again. I became alarmed and shouted to the crowd to keep still. Apparently, a majority of the passengers were on the one side of the boat, and this had overweighted it and caused it to list. Suddenly, the hawsers, which held the boat to the pier, snapped, and the officers pulled the gangplank and refused to allow any more on the boat. At this time, everybody was panic-stricken. Women screamed and men tried to quiet them. I attempted to reach an upper deck, but could not because of the crowd and excitement, and ran back to the port side where the gangway had been. The boat then slowly drifted away from the pier, rolling as it slipped into midstream, and a moment later it had turned over on its side. I climbed over on the side of the boat and stayed there until I was taken off by lifesavers. Many of the passengers leaped into the water as the boat went over. Scores of others were caught in the cabins and drowned. When the small boats began coming out to us, I worked with the other survivors in taking passengers out of the water and cutting holes in the cabins to remove bodies. Mrs. William Peterson, wife of a foreman of the Western Electric Company, was pulled through a porthole of the ship to safety. Quote, "I was pulled clear underwater," she said, "and when I came to the surface, I saw two hands reaching out of a porthole. They pulled me through. I don't know whether my husband, daughter, and sister-in-law were saved or not." As you can probably guess, based on what I just shared with you, there are a lot more articles on the Eastland disaster in the New York Times, just based on the sheer amount of space they took up in the New York Times. And I'll keep sharing these articles with you, but I'll do it piece by piece because there are just so many. I want to keep bringing these stories to the forefront because they offer firsthand accounts from people who were there. And many of these accounts, to this day, they're either not source-cited or they're not shared at all, and they need to be. And this is especially true in the spirit of reasonably exhaustive research. It is important to include everything that was reported in publications such as the New York Times and other newspapers. These articles weren't written from a distance. They were written by Chicago-based journalists working for the New York papers. Many of these reporters seem to have been on the ground interviewing witnesses and perhaps witnessing the Eastland disaster firsthand. I have the feeling that there's more information out there, and we just need to know where to find it, and when I do, I will share it with you in the name of history, right? One thing I'd love to learn more about is how this reporting actually worked behind the scenes. I love to get under the hood of things, as you can probably tell. And we know that the Associated Press had wire services, and by now we understand the role of telegraphs, especially at the turn of the 20th century. But the logistics are still fascinating. How was this information gathered? How was it written, transmitted, and ultimately shared with the world? We will continue to explore that in the future. For now, though, I'm grateful that so many of these articles have been preserved, and I hope you find them as fascinating and as informative as I did. And I have to admit that when I first saw that the New York Times had covered the Eastland disaster, I assumed incorrectly that they just copied the reports from the Chicago papers, and that wasn't necessarily the case. Again, they had Chicago-based correspondents on the ground, so what was their role? Clearly, they were deeply involved. Names like H. Percy Miller and John Fay keep coming up, and I have the feeling we'll uncover even more information about them as time goes on. So stay tuned, and I will talk to you next week. Hey, that's it for this episode, and thanks for coming along for the ride. Please subscribe or follow so you can keep up with all the episodes. And for more information, please go to my website. That's www.flowerintheriver.com. I hope you'll consider buying my book, available as audiobook, ebook, paperback, and hardcover, because I still owe people money. And that's my running joke. But the one thing I'm serious about is that this podcast and my book are dedicated to the memory of all who experienced the Eastland disaster of 1915. Goodbye for now.